Somewhere beneath the flat, sun-baked plains of southern Iraq, under layers of mud and salt and 6,000 years of accumulated sediment, there are the ruins of the world's first city. Not the oldest settlement, not a large village or a proto-urban cluster, a city with administrative districts and specialized labor and a writing system complex enough to record debt, law, and poetry, with temples tall enough to be seen for miles across a flat landscape, with roads and canals and a population of tens of thousands organized under a government that issued rations, kept records, and conducted foreign policy. Built at a time when most of the world was still operating in small farming communities that left behind nothing more permanent than post holes. The textbooks will tell you the Sumerians were the founders of human civilization, the inventors of writing, the architects of the first cities, the people who gave us mathematics, astronomy, law codes, and the world's oldest surviving literature. They arose in the river valleys between the Tigris and Euphrates sometime around 4500 BC. They built Uruk and Ur and Eridu and Nippur. They dominated Mesopotamia for 3,000 years before being absorbed into the Akkadian and then the Babylonian civilizations that followed them. They are treated in every standard account of ancient history as the foundation of everything that came after. The first chapter of human civilization. Origin point. Beginning. Then ancient DNA was extracted from the bones buried beneath their cities. And when researchers compared those sequences to the populations that the textbooks say produced the Sumerians, something did not align. The genetic record described a discontinuity nobody had predicted. The Sumerians themselves left behind a clue so obvious that linguists had been staring at it for 150 years without fully understanding what it meant. And the physical record of how Sumerian society actually functioned, recovered across a century of excavation from their royal tombs and their temple archives and their legal records, described something almost nothing like the civilizational founding story that every school curriculum had been built around. The Sumerians were never who we were told. And more unsettling than that, the question of where they actually came from has an answer that the textbooks have never been willing to name directly. Because naming it requires confronting the possibility that the first civilization on Earth emerged from a place that no longer exists. To understand what the evidence overturned, you have to first understand what the evidence was overturning. And that means going back to a problem so old and so stubborn that the scholars who study ancient languages gave it its own name. The Sumerian problem. Every major language on Earth belongs to a family. Languages that share common ancestors, related grammatical structures, overlapping vocabularies, traceable connections to other languages spoken by related populations in adjacent regions. The Indo-European family connects Sanskrit to Latin, to ancient Greek, to modern English, through a single reconstructed ancestor, spoken somewhere on the Eurasian steppe 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. The Semitic family connects ancient Akkadian and Hebrew and Phoenician to modern Arabic and Amharic, through a common ancestor spoken in the ancient Near East before any of those civilizations existed. The Sino-Tibetan family, the Afro-Asiatic family, the Dravidian family, the Austronesian family. Every major human language tradition has relatives. Every one of them can be placed on a genealogical tree connecting it to something older. Sumerian has no family. It has no relatives. Linguists have been looking for one since the 19th century, when Assyriologists first began deciphering cuneiform tablets and realized that some of those tablets were written in a language that corresponded to nothing else in the ancient record. It is not related to Akkadian, the Semitic language that eventually replaced it in Mesopotamia. It is not related to any Iranian language. It is not related to any Anatolian language. It is not related to ancient Egyptian or to any African language family. Attempts have been made to connect it to Dravidian, the language family of southern India, on the basis of some structural similarities. None have produced consensus. After 150 years of systematic effort by some of the most capable linguists who have ever worked in the field, Sumerian remains completely isolated. A language without a known parent, without known siblings, without any demonstrable connection to any other human language spoken anywhere on Earth. That isolation is not a minor academic curiosity. It is a flare sent up from the archaeological record. Languages do not appear from nowhere. Every human language is descended from an earlier one, spoken by a population that moved, changed, and generated descendants who carried the language with them. A language isolate at this scale, spoken by the founders of the world's first complex civilization in a specific geographic location at a specific moment in history, is not a linguistic accident. It is the fingerprint of a population that arrived in Mesopotamia from somewhere so isolated that it left no linguistic relatives anywhere in the ancient world. The Sumerians did not develop from the populations that surrounded them. They came from somewhere else. The question that has consumed scholarship for 150 years is where? The ground itself was sending signals that nobody had been equipped to read until recently. The culture that immediately preceded the Sumerians in Mesopotamia is known as the Ubaid culture. Named for a small archaeological site near the city of Ur, where it was first identified, the Ubaid was a sophisticated Neolithic farming tradition that spread across the entire ancient Near East between roughly 6500 and 3800 BC. Ubaid pottery has been found from the Persian Gulf to the upper reaches of the Tigris and from the Mediterranean coast to the Iranian plateau. It represents one of the most geographically extensive cultural traditions ever documented in the prehistoric Near East. And it was entirely local. The genetic profiles recovered from Ubaid-era skeletal remains and from the populations of Iran and Anatolia and the Levant that fed into the Ubaid cultural sphere connect cleanly to the deep farming populations of the ancient Near East. They are the people you would expect to find in that region at that time, descended from the first farmers who domesticated wheat and sheep in the Fertile Crescent 10,000 years ago and spread gradually across Western Asia in the millennia that followed. Then, around 3800 BC, something changed in southern Mesopotamia. The Ubaid tradition ended not gradually but abruptly. A new material culture appeared in the archaeological record, concentrated specifically in the southernmost part of the river valley, in the region that would become the Sumerian heartland. The cities began to grow. The pottery changed. A new architectural tradition appeared, centered on massive temple platforms called ziggurats, unlike anything built by Ubaid populations anywhere in the Near East. And the writing system appeared, not slowly, not as a gradual evolution from pictographic symbols used by earlier populations, fully formed, from its first recoverable examples, as a complex administrative tool capable of recording transactions, tracking labor, and managing the kind of logistical complexity that only a city requires. Ancient DNA recovered from southern Mesopotamian sites spanning the transition between the Ubaid and early Sumerian periods showed something that the architectural and linguistic evidence had been implying all along. The population changed. Not entirely, not in a single generation, but the genetic profile of individuals buried in the emerging urban centers of the Sumerian south showed signals that were not present in the Ubaid populations that had preceded them. Ancestry components pointing not toward the established farming populations of the Near Eastern highlands, but toward something with a different geographic signature, something that had entered the Mesopotamian gene pool from a direction that did not match the regional baseline. The question that followed was the same question the linguistic isolation had always raised. Where had they come from? The answer that has emerged over the past 2 decades of archaeological and genetic research points toward a place that cannot be excavated, cannot be directly sampled, and cannot be confirmed through ordinary archaeological means, because the place in question is underwater. Jeffrey Rose, an archaeologist specializing in the prehistory of the Arabian Peninsula, proposed in 2010 what has since become known as the Gulf Oasis hypothesis. The argument rests on a geological fact about the Persian Gulf that is not in dispute. The Gulf as it exists today, the body of water separating the Arabian Peninsula from Iran and reaching the Indian Ocean through the Strait of Hormuz, did not exist in its current form until approximately 6000 BC. Before that date, the sea level was substantially lower. The basin that is now the Persian Gulf was a low-lying river valley fed by the combined drainage of the Tigris, the Euphrates, the Karun, and several Arabian rivers. This valley would have been one of the most fertile and well-watered regions in the ancient Near East, located at the center of a geography that connected Africa, Arabia, the Indian subcontinent, and the Iranian plateau. Protected from the extreme aridity of the surrounding desert by its river systems and its access to the Proto-Indian Ocean, it would have been a habitable and likely heavily populated region throughout the period when the rest of the ancient Near East was occupied by scattered farming villages and nomadic herders. Around 8,000 years ago, as the global sea levels rose in the aftermath of the last ice age, the Persian Gulf began to fill. Not instantly, not catastrophically, in the way that popular accounts sometimes frame it, but steadily, over centuries, inundating the valley floor at a rate that would have been perceptible within a single human lifetime. The populations living in the Gulf Basin would have had time to move, and the direction they could move, following the rivers that had always connected their homeland to the north, was into Mesopotamia, into the river valleys of the Tigris and Euphrates, into the region that would become the Sumerian heartland. This is not a fringe hypothesis. It has been developed and refined by serious researchers using satellite mapping, sedimentological core analysis, and the genetic data recovered from Gulf-adjacent populations. What it proposes is that the people who would become the Sumerians did not originate in Mesopotamia. They were refugees from a drowned civilization, arriving in the river valleys with a fully formed cultural and linguistic tradition that had developed in a place that no archaeology could ever directly access. The isolation of the Sumerian language, unique among all human languages ever recorded, would be explained not by mystery but by geography. A population living in a bounded river valley for thousands of years, separated from the surrounding world by desert and sea, would naturally develop a language with no relatives in the adjacent regions. The language isolate is the signature of the oasis. The genetic discontinuity is the fingerprint of the migration. And the sudden appearance of urban complexity in the Sumerian south, without local precedent, without the gradual developmental stages that characterize most transitions from village to city, would reflect a population that arrived already knowing how to build what they built. They did not invent civilization in Mesopotamia. They brought it with them from the Gulf. This is the part of the story that the textbook version has consistently refused to accommodate, because it requires accepting that the origin of human civilization traces to a place that no longer exists, that its founders were a displaced population carrying a drowned culture northward along river systems that still flow through modern Iraq, and that the first chapter of human history was not a beginning but a continuation of something older that the sea swallowed before anyone learned to write it down. What they built after arriving is not in dispute. The city of Uruk, at its peak around 3100 BC, was the largest urban settlement on Earth, home to an estimated 50,000 people at a time when most human communities numbered in the hundreds. It had specialized neighborhoods for potters and metalworkers and weavers. It had a temple complex covering several acres, built on a raised platform that dominated the flat plain for miles in every direction. It had an administrative apparatus that tracked the movement of grain, livestock, and labor across a territory that stretched hundreds of miles from the urban center. And it had a writing system capable of recording all of it, the first in the world, evolving within a few centuries from simple pictographic notation into the abstract wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay tablets that we call cuneiform. The first written words in human history are Sumerian. They are not poetry. They are not prayers. They are receipts. Accounts of grain dispersed, sheep counted, labor days tracked. The first thing that human beings thought worth preserving in a permanent record was not a declaration of faith or a king's glory. It was a ledger. The Sumerians, in other words, did not invent writing to capture the divine. They invented it to manage a system too complex for human memory to hold alone. That pragmatism runs through every layer of what the archaeological record reveals about Sumerian society. The law codes, the first of which predate the Babylonian Code of Hammurabi by 3 centuries, are detailed and specific in ways that reflect a society deeply familiar with the complications of dense urban life. Property disputes, inheritance claims, commercial contracts, the rights of widows, the obligations of debtors. This was not a simple agricultural community governed by custom. It was a bureaucratic state in the modern sense of the term, operating through written records, institutional accountability, and legal precedent. They built schools and trained scribes and produced graduates who spent their careers managing the administrative machinery of the city. They had a professional class, they had taxation, they had foreign policy, and they had something that the textbook version of Sumerian civilization has consistently understated. They had a capacity for organized violence and a relationship with death that the foundation story of human civilization rarely discusses in full. The royal tombs of Ur were excavated between 1922 and 1934 by the British archaeologist Leonard Woolley. The site had been identified as a major Sumerian cemetery, and the excavation produced finds of extraordinary richness. Jewelry in gold and lapis lazuli, musical instruments with inlaid decoration, vessels in precious metal, objects so fine and so numerous that Woolley, who was not given to theatrical understatement, described them as beyond anything he had expected to find anywhere in the ancient world. The royal burials were dated to approximately 2600 to 2500 BC, the height of Sumerian urban civilization. What stopped the excavation, in the sense of forcing a revision of everything the team had assumed they were dealing with, was not the wealth of the finds. It was the company the royals had brought with them. The tomb of a woman, identified through an inscribed cylinder seal as Puabi, a queen of Ur, contained 68 additional individuals. Servants, musicians, soldiers, court attendants, all dead. All positioned with the same deliberate care that had been applied to the queen herself. The musicians were found with their instruments still in their hands, a golden lyre placed across a lap, a harp leaning against a wall, the bones of fingers still resting on the strings. The soldiers were found with their weapons beside them. The servants were found in the postures of servants attending to their duties, arranged in the chamber as if the court had simply ceased to move in the middle of an ordinary moment of service. The forensic analysis of the skeletal remains confirmed what the arrangement implied. These individuals had not been killed before the burial and their bodies placed inside. They had entered the tomb alive. Small clay cups, the kind used for drinking, were recovered near the skulls of several attendants. The cups had contained something. Whatever it was, it had allowed 68 people to descend into a sealed underground chamber and remain there while the entrance was closed above them. This was not an isolated find. Woolley documented similar patterns in 16 of the royal tombs he excavated. The numbers varied. Some tombs contained only a handful of attendants. One contained 74, but the pattern was consistent. The rulers of Ur at the height of Sumerian civilization did not go into the afterlife alone. They went with their courts, and the courts, by every available piece of evidence, went willingly. This detail does not appear in the standard account of Sumerian civilization as the founders of writing, law, and urban life. It is mentioned in specialist literature and then set aside, because it does not fit the narrative of civilizational progress that the founding story requires. The first civilization on Earth, in this reading, is supposed to be the beginning of human advancement. The tombs of Ur are not a comfortable fit for that story. They describe a society capable of organizing mass death as a ritual expression of royal power, persuading dozens of individuals to follow their rulers into the ground, and of doing so with enough institutional authority that no one in the surviving record appears to have protested the practice. The Sumerians were not the peaceful inventors of human progress. They were the architects of a system so powerful, so coherent, and so capable of organizing human behavior at scale that it could command its own court to die in formation. That is not the beginning of civilization. In the benign sense the textbooks prefer, it is the beginning of the state, of centralized power, of the specific capacity that human institutions have always had to absorb individuals so completely that the boundary between the institution and the self disappears entirely. The Sumerian language was officially dead as a spoken tongue by around 2000 BC, when Akkadian had replaced it in everyday life across Mesopotamia. But it did not disappear in any meaningful sense. It survived for another 2,000 years as the language of religion, scholarship, and ritual. Akkadian scribes learned to write it. Babylonian priests performed ceremonies in it. Mathematical and astronomical texts were composed in it long after anyone had spoken it in conversation. It occupied the same cultural position in the ancient Near East that Latin would later occupy in medieval Europe. A dead language kept alive by institutional authority because the texts written in it were too important to abandon. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the world's oldest surviving work of literature, is Sumerian in origin. The story of a king, two-thirds divine, who watches his closest companion die and sets out across the world in search of immortality, only to discover that no such thing exists, and that the only thing that persists is the city he built and the walls he raised. It is not, in other words, a founding myth in the triumphant sense. It is a meditation on mortality, on the inadequacy of power, and on the only legacy that can survive the death of the man who built it. The Sumerians, who built the world's first cities and produced the world's first written records, appear to have understood from the beginning that the individual does not survive. What survives is the structure. That understanding is encoded in their DNA as literally as it is encoded in their texts. Population-scale genetic analysis of modern Near Eastern populations has established traceable continuity between the ancient Mesopotamian population and the people living in the region today. Modern Iraqis, Iranians, Kuwaitis, and populations across the Arabian Peninsula carry ancestry components that map onto the ancient Mesopotamian genetic baseline with a specificity that speaks to thousands of years of continuous habitation in the same river valleys. The specific ancestry signals associated with the Sumerian-era discontinuity, the components that separated the early urban population from the surrounding Ubaid baseline, are present in the modern populations of the Gulf region and southern Mesopotamia at frequencies that reflect their long persistence in the local gene pool. The Sumerians were never absorbed in the sense the textbooks mean when they describe the Akkadian conquest and the Babylonian succession. The political entity dissolved, the language retreated into the temple, but the people remained. The farmers who had worked the irrigation channels of the Sumerian south continued to work those channels under Akkadian governors and Babylonian kings and Persian satraps, and eventually under the rulers of every empire that subsequently discovered what the Sumerians had always known: that the river valley between the Tigris and the Euphrates was the most productive agricultural land in the ancient world, worth controlling, worth organizing, worth building on. The genetic record of the people who built it never left. The cuneiform writing system, the administrative technology invented by the Sumerians to manage the complexity of their cities, influenced every subsequent writing tradition in the ancient Near East. Akkadian adopted it wholesale. Elamite, Hittite, Ugaritic, Old Persian, at least half a dozen ancient languages were eventually written in systems derived from the Sumerian original. The alphabet that underlies modern English and Arabic and Hebrew and Greek traces through Phoenician to earlier Semitic scripts that developed in dialogue with the cuneiform tradition. The written word that you're encountering right now, in whatever form it reaches you, is a direct descendant of the system a refugee population developed in the river valleys of southern Iraq 6,000 years ago. They did not vanish. Their language survives in the structure of every writing system on Earth. Their genetic material persists in the populations that have lived in the same river valley continuously since before the first tablet was pressed. Their administrative innovations, the city, the law code, the written contract, the professional scribe, the centralized state, have never stopped being used by every complex society that followed them. The Sumerian problem, the unanswerable question of where they came from, has an answer that the water has been hiding for 6,000 years. The language is isolated because the people were isolated. in a river valley that the sea has since reclaimed for long enough to produce something that resembled nothing else in the world around them. They arrived in Mesopotamia with a civilization already formed. They built on what they had brought. And when the political system that organized them finally ended, they stayed. The farmer stayed. The scribe stayed. The language stayed in the temples. The genes stayed in the population. What the textbooks called the world's first civilization was actually its second act. The first was swallowed by the Persian Gulf before anyone thought to write anything down. What survived was the continuation, the part that reached dry land, the part that put its records in clay instead of water. The ruins beneath the Iraqi plain are not the beginning of the story. They are what remained when the beginning was lost. And the people buried beneath those ruins, the ones whose DNA researchers are only now beginning to read with the precision the question deserves, are the ones who carried the beginning northward out of the rising water and built what they built because they already knew how. The sea took the original. What we call civilization is the copy.